Mark and I were having this discussion, and he is more eloquent on it than I am. But we've gone from Martin Luther King to the Reverend Al Sharpton. And as a leader, as he's trying to be this weekend, it's very dispiriting.
That's Margaret Coulson, who is no conservative. And she summed it up best I can sum it up. Let's welcome in Dr. Alveda King, Pastoral Associate and Director of African American Outreach for Priests for Life. Just a wonderful person who I'm privileged to know, also Newsmax contributor. Hey, Doctor, how are you?
Absolutely great, and it's wonderful, Steve, to join you and your listeners today. I can understand the distress of a parent or a person who has to deal with young Americans or any Americans. So, yes, I can understand that concern.
Yes, well, what she was talking about, that was Margaret Coulson talking about the fact that, we've gone from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., your uncle, to Al Sharpton at the same spot almost 50 years later, and it was his march. It was he called everybody together, and she said it's distressing. And I got to agree, because I don't think your uncle would think, in my opinion, I don't think he'd think too highly of some of the things Al Sharpton has done and said over the years.
Well, actually, I did not attend the march. My cousin Martin spoke at the march, and my cousin Bernice prayed at the conclusion.
Right.
And I watched it on television. I'm going to be with Bernice on Wednesday at an interfaith service at Shiloh Baptist Church in D.C., and then later on the mall at the Lincoln Memorial on the actual anniversary date, ringing a bell. But Reverend Sharpton, some of the things that he's promoting and saying, of course, have gone far beyond what my uncle intended and what they were all marching for. 50 years ago, my mom and dad were there as well. They were marching for freedom, for justice, for jobs, for decent housing and better education. Those are basic needs that all human beings deserve according to just our simple humanity. And we were not asking for separate but equal, but equality on those levels. Now, all these years later, all these causes have been added, and causes divide people rather than uniting people. And so, as you say, the lady who expressed that concern was not even a conservative, but she was still distressed. So I must say that Reverend Al Sharpton is a far cry from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, I think you said it very, very eloquently, very politely, and very appropriately, as I would expect from you, Dr. King. Let me ask you, you did an interview with Newsmax a couple of days ago, or maybe yesterday, and you said something very interesting, that as you watched from afar, part of your uncle's dream did come true, and that part was watching the aforementioned Martin Luther King III and Bernice King be judged, as you put it, on the content of their character and not on the color of their skin, which is what your uncle wanted for everybody.
Absolutely, and I know my cousin Martin talks about, there's a book, I think the name of it is My Daddy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. too. He and his little daughter and his wife had something on yesterday after the march on Saturday. But Martin's remarks, I could understand them. If I could say anything to my cousin Martin, though, it's this: we've had 50 years of trying to achieve those exact same things that he was talking about. But if we don't return to God, and that's what his sister did at the end of the march, she called out to God. And that's what my Uncle ML, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., my daddy, A.D., Daddy King, they prayed. They called out to God, and they said, we're imperfect. We can't do this. We're going to mess up. We're going to sin. We need you, God. Please help us. And they wanted to be treated as one human race, one blood, not separate races, because my uncle said we must learn to live together as brothers, and I add as sisters, or perish as fools. So the human condition needs help. Martin Luther King Jr. knew that. My daddy, A.D., knew that. I did not hear that theme from Al Sharpton. So I wanted to remind my cousin Martin, I don't have to remind Bernice because she's walking in those same steps of prayer. But we're not going to resolve anything without prayer. We're not. Absolutely,
and I want to get to that in a second also, and I want to get to a terrible misconception about your uncle, which you and I have talked about very often. But first, let me address Martin Luther King III. Rather than play the soundbite, if you haven't heard it, I'm sure you did, I'll play it for you. But he did something that, to me, you know, and I'm not you, and I'm not black either, but to me seemed very, I don't know, inappropriate or out of place or very provocative. He brought. Okay, let's play cut number 11. Can we get cut number 11 in there? Okay, here we go.
So I stand here today in this sacred place, in my father's footsteps. I am humbled by the heavy hand of history, but more than that, I like you continue to feel his presence. I, like you, continue to hear his voice crying out in the wilderness. The admonition is clear. This is not the time for nostalgic commemoration, nor is this the time for self-congratulatory celebration. The task is not done. The journey is not complete. We can and we must do more.
All right, that was good, but this is the cut. I should have followed my own instincts. Here's cut 12. Listen to this one.
The vision preached by my father a half-century ago was that his 4 little children would one day live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. However, sadly, the tears of Trayvon Martin's mother and father remind us that far too frequently the color of one's skin remains a license to profile, to arrest, and to even murder with no regard for the content of one's character. Regressive stand-your-ground laws must be repealed. Federal anti-profiling legislation must be enacted.
All right, let's talk about Trayvon for a second here. Do you think it was appropriate to use Trayvon Martin as an example of the skin color resulting in murder? I mean, you know, I just don't see that. There was this was not a racial case, and even if you think it might have been, was this the appropriate time and place in this kind of speech to bring up Trayvon Martin? Do you think?
Let me mention this because I noticed his sister a little later. You might remember that Trayvon Martin's mother spoke, and then Bernice King, standing with her and before her, began to pray for mercy and compassion. So the correct context, if Trayvon was to have been mentioned at all, would have been to say that it's tragic in America that our children are being slaughtered, killed, murdered, aborted, and with skin color issues, racial profiling still occurs in America, and there was a big debate as to whether or not there was profiling with Trayvon. I actually, believe it or not, thought there was some of that. But then just last week, I think it was 3 ethnically African-American young men killed a Caucasian man for fun because they were bored. And so that same kind of pattern with our young people not respecting the sanctity of life. And so we're going to see all of these disasters, as I call them. And so I believe that rather than take Trayvon and just play a race card and inflame emotions, we've got to look at that deeper issue where in Chicago, black young boys and girls are killing each other, especially the black African-American men. Young men are killing other African-American young men. So it's not simply a racial issue. And so I don't like to see the race card played ever at all, and certainly at a time when people's emotions are tender. It's not nostalgia that we are celebrating. We are admitting, many of us, I am certainly, that all the problems have not been solved. But my answer is we still have to go back to God. Right. And so in answering that, if I were my cousin Martin, I would not have approached that or taken that time to take the very sensitive issue of Trayvon Martin, the pain of the Zimmermans and the Martins, and to try to use it at that point. I would not have made that.
Okay, and I appreciate that answer. Now let's talk about one misconception here before I ask you what you might expect from President Obama on Wednesday. Your uncle would not be a pro-abortion movement leader, would he?
My uncle, in his own words, and that's what I wanted to remind Rev Al Sharpton and some of those who were marching, Martin Luther King Jr., during his lifetime in the 1950s, wrote an advice column for Ebony magazine, and there was a young man. I'm going to answer 2 questions with one response on that. There was a young man who said, Dr. King, I was involved in committing a crime. My girlfriend got pregnant, and I would not marry her, and a crime was committed. Well, abortion, of course, at that time was illegal. The young man's, the mother of his baby, their baby, aborted the baby. And Martin Luther King Jr. basically says, well, now that you admit that there was a problem and you're repenting, then we can go on. He also said to another young man who said, Dear Dr. King, I feel about boys the way other boys feel about girls. What am I going to do with this problem? Martin Luther King Jr. wrote this. Now that you realize you have a problem, we can look into solutions. And so even though the Bible says over in the book of Matthew, some people are born eunuchs, some are made eunuchs, and some choose to be eunuchs. So we understand that some people actually can be born without a sexual desire for the opposite sex. But the answer then is not to enter into behavior that's going to interrupt the procreative pattern for the natural family. So those are things that are not being properly taught. But Martin Luther King Jr. during his lifetime respected and regarded natural marriage. He performed ceremonies and spoke of procreation in those ceremonies. So people need to look back in history if they want to attach certain tactics and what I call antics to Martin Luther King Jr., they need to go back and see what he said himself about those position.
Absolutely, and you've expressed that so eloquently to me in the past. I did want to bring it up today. And one final question: I'm sure you'll try at least to be listening on Wednesday to the president. Well, you will be listening to the president. What?
I'll be there.
Right, you'll be there. That's what I meant. Yeah, you told me earlier. So what do you expect to hear from him?
I'm not sure, but I would be very disappointed if the president would think it would be appropriate to get there and attempt to stand in the same place that Martin Luther King Jr. stood 50 years ago and try to emulate that and stir up those same emotions with those same words. I pray that he really doesn't do that. You'll remember Glenn Beck and I in 2010 went to the Lincoln Memorial on August 28th, but we stood several steps down because I remember saying to Glenn, I'm not Martin Luther King Jr. It doesn't look like you are either. And we chuckled. So we kind of just knew that would not be what needed to happen. I did say I, too, have a dream, but I gave my 2010 dream. So
should the president not stand in the same spot? Should the venue, in fact, be different?
No, I'm saying it's okay if he stands in the same spot, but I just want him to emulate.
Right, I got you.
Like he's a new Martin Luther King, because he actually is not.
Okay.
So I don't know what he will say, but maybe he'll hear that little suggestion. We'll just have to see.
All right, listen, you know how I feel about you, and you know how honored I feel to know you, and how privileged I feel to talk to you whenever we talk. And I look forward to our next conversation, Dr. King. Maybe we'll speak in the aftermath of the speech. Thank you very much.
I hope so. Thank you for the suggestion. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Alveda King, ladies and gentlemen, Pastoral Associate and Director of African American Outreach for Priests for Life and Gospel of Life Ministries, author, Newsmax contributor, and the niece of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Very interesting. Al Sharpton is a far cry from Martin Luther King Jr., and she doesn't want the president to emulate and stir up the same emotions or try to that